before we move into that, I need you to first subscribe, leave a like on the video, leave a comment. So this is into around 2010 and beyond. Enter Shinzo Abe. Abe came into power and he said that, okay, well, my economic policy, or Abenomics, is to have 3 arrows. And it's essentially the same shit that they've been doing before, but even more to the extreme. If you thought QE was out of control, Abenomics has another deal for you. So, for example, first one, arrow 1, which was to increase the money supply. So we're just going to keep printing money, right? If your interest rates are stuck at 0, just make them negative. And then what had happened was that their quantitative easing didn't create inflation. It just, if that doesn't create inflation, well, you just didn't spend enough. You just need more quantitative easing, throw more money at it, right? And let's say, the world's going to shit or the markets are going to shit or anything like that, just buy the dip. The Bank of Japan just kept buying more government debt, corporate debt, and the market itself, it actually got directly involved in the market to the point where they owned about 70% of the Bank of Japan's, the Bank of Japan owned about 70% of the government debt, 15% of all corporate debt, and 7% of the entire Japanese market. Arrow 2. Increase government spending. They launched spending packages to the point where their debt to GDP ratio was 240%. So for every thing that they produce, they're already at a deficit because they're about 2.5 product goods behind what they should be producing, which means that if they were to have a correction, they'd have a really bad day on this sort of situation, right? They also increased taxes on consumption goods, which, again, I don't know why you're punishing the consumer. You want them to spend more. But, again, the result of that, the economy went back into recession every time he did this because people aren't going to spend. I don't know what you expected increasing taxes are going to do for you, right? But he kept doing this back and forth spending and with the hopes of inflation expectations, but it didn't happen. Every time that they increase spending on something, whether it be infrastructure, increasing the monetary supply or anything like that, any type of inflation that they had, they just killed it to the point where it just negated itself. So you'll have let's say a 1% inflation projected, right? Because you're spending more money, you're devaluing your currency, you're raising taxes so people aren't spending. That good that you did just nullified itself. So that 1% that you were supposed to have is now 0. So congrats. You played yourself. And the third one was structural reform, if you could even call that. So on the corporate side, the corporates, again, similar to several years ago, started to save more money. So what they did with this money that they were given by the government was that they used it to increase shareholder rights, their intention was to increase competition among the corporations, but what they also did was that they to benefit the corporations was they cut the taxes for the corporations. So corporate tax got cut, not the consumer, not the household maker tax, not the regular citizen tax, the corporate taxes. They also, laid in some deregulations and stuff like that. And they also formed a lot of trade deals for these corporations specific because they wanted them to start transacting and, keep the Japanese people working and produce more goods and stuff like that, right? Didn't really have that effect, but on the local side, because people were unable to access, people were not able to find new jobs, find higher paying jobs or anything like that, households started to save more money. And inflation barely saw spikes, but not the 2% mark, and consumption is barely higher in 2020, so last year, than it was in this last sort of crisis and beyond. Now, there's another part I had in this where remember how I talked about people were not the birth rate was declining, right? And that affects see here's the thing. This is my opinion about this, but essentially you could have this constant spending and stuff like that, right? If your population is increasing because every new person that's born on top of the people that they replace. So if a family has 3 kids rather than 2, that's just an extra taxpayer in the future, which means that this is somewhat sustainable theoretically if your birth rates are on a continuous incline of this, because more people are being birthed, more people are going to become taxpayers, more people are going to keep the economy turning because they're going to consume, they're going to make money, consume, and so forth. It's just going to keep the wheels turning. But they were declining in birth rates. So I wrote this extra section in there, but this was flawed. Their monetary policy was flawed for the three arrows because they essentially lowered interest rates to stimulate the Japanese economy. But the Japanese economy was already mature and couldn't grow anymore. And what I mean by that is that like they're not making any new innovative tech. They're not like, having increased birth rates. They're not, doing anything crazy enough to overshadow what their current debt to GDP was. But essentially, there was, because of the decrease in the population, they had lower demand. And on the corporate level, they just said, because they couldn't find any workers to work in their factories anymore, they just started exploring more into the automation route, which, if you were already retiring at the time, you didn't care. You had a nice pension from the government. You're fine or whatever, right? But this continued to cause deflation because no one was buying anything. And the corporates also evaded stuff like taxes, like they saw previously, but seem to ignored, by paying out higher dividends to their investors. And they also, started hoarding cash. They just didn't feel the need to like really spend on anything. They didn't need to innovate. They didn't need to expand or anything like that, right? Automation was saving them a lot of money. And they just said, okay, well, I mean, this is good for our shareholders, and you guys want to raise taxes? Okay, cool. We'll lower our tax bracket, or we'll not pay you out as much, and we'll just throw it on our investors and stuff like that, right? So, and some of these investors can get around this by having like foreign tax policies, and it's a whole mess. I'm not going to get into it or pretend to understand it, but there's ways around paying your country's like full tax bracket. I mean, Apple's doing it right now with the Ireland thing, but this is Japan. But in terms of the citizenship policies, what had happened was that they were Abe tried to have more job security for men, so like unemployment insurance and so forth, right? But he also wanted to try to bait women back into the workforce by creating new daycares, expanding parental leave, and trying to get So he did this because he realized that a lot of people, like if he could create some sort of World War II scenario where women enter the workforce and they can essentially have a career, also have a family, that'd be good for him. But it didn't really work out as intended. But he also expanded this on top of this because his population was also kind of declining. One way to combat that was that he started letting in foreign workers, and he started to fast track them and just like automatically approve them and take them in. Now, I'm not against immigration. And again, this is purely from a historical point of view, but you need skilled immigration. You can't just take in someone who is just there because they didn't like their home country or anything like that, right? Sure, they might have come from a war-torn home country, but if they're not contributing and they're not giving back to the system that helps support them and help bring them over for a better life, then you have another person that's kind of like an anchor on the system. And if you bring in too much of those things, your current citizens are not going to like that, because they're going to be like, okay, well, why are we paying for these guys just to lounge around and do nothing all day? It's not fair, right? Why is our government doing this? Again, I'm not a political channel or anything like that. This is just what has happened in the history and what they have done and said. But yeah, this will probably just end the part for the Japanese history and stuff like that. For now, this is probably going to be cut up because I'm looking at the timer right now. It's about 40 minutes long, and it's about the time I took to explain this to someone. But yeah, beyond that right now, yeah, just remember, just because you're a day trader, sorry, actually, not yet.